Hello, Marco here. Today I'm showing how to add skid sounds and skid marks to a Chaos vehicle. So without further ado, let's start Unreal Engine 5 and let's get started. By the way, if you don't feel like typing, the full project with enhancements is available for a small fee from the link in the description. Let's go to Library, launch Unreal Engine 5.03. And once this is loaded, let's go to Games, Vehicle, and let's create a new project based on the vehicle template. And we're going to call it Vehicle Skid. Let's click Create. Let's dismiss this annoying message about plugins. And we can start by importing a couple of assets. So what we need is a texture for the skid marks, and the texture is looking like this. You can usually find them on the internet as paid or free resources. It doesn't have to fade at the sides. It can also be just the center part. The important thing is that it has to have an alpha mask, so it has to be transparent, right? So the part of the thread are visible, but the rest is transparent. And the other resource that we need is a skid loop sound. So basically we need a looping sound for the tire skid, and the one that I have created out of a YouTube video sounds a bit like this. And of course it's not perfect, but I think it's good enough for demonstration. You can always get a professional sound or get paid resource, or some people are using sounds which are provided through mods from different games. Just make sure that you have the license to use it. Okay, we take these two assets and let's start, by the way, with the sound part. So I right click on content, a new folder, let's call it audio. And then within the audio folder, let's import our wave file. And we can play it in this way. Okay, what we're gonna do out of it is create a sound cue. So right click on the sound, create cue. And the reason we want a cue is that we want to be able to make some changes to the sound through the cue and maybe add some variations. I'll show that later, but we'll start with a very simple cue. I think we accept standard name. Now let's open the cue like this. Okay, so we have our sound cue, and this is the input wave file, and this is the output. So click on the input and make sure the looping is selected, because this is a loop, and then we can play the cue. Again, not perfectly looping, but I think it's gonna be good enough for this tutorial and for the demonstration. So let's save the cue, close the window, and now what we want to do is identify the vehicle's blueprint. So inside vehicle template, blueprint, sports car. That's a car that you see in the level when you play. Just place a second to see it. Yeah, this car here. And of course at the moment has no sounds and no skid marks, but that's what we're going to add. Okay, so we have identified the blueprint for the car. Double click to open it. And here's what we are going to do. So as first thing, we want to control the skid sound through its volume, but initially we want the volume to be 0. So what we do is start by adding the plus add audio component to the car, and we call it skid sound. Of course, spelled correctly. And now we go to the right, and under sound, you should see the cue that we just created. So select it, and we can set its initial volume to 0. Okay. Also make sure that it auto activates, because we want it to play continuously. Just you will not hear it when there is no skidding. Okay, with that done, actually let's put the volume back to 1 for a moment so that we can hear it. If we compile and save and then go back to level and play, we should already hear the skid sound. Well, of course it plays continuously and without the car moving, and the reason is that we just added it as a component and then we set this volume to 1, and since it's auto activating, it will play, always play. But if we set the volume back to 0 and then compile and save, now the sound is still playing, but we will not hear it. And what we want to do next is to make it audible when the car is actually skidding. Okay. So back to the vehicle blueprint. We will be working out of event tick by extending it. So there is already something happening in the event tick, and basically there is a detection to whether the vehicle is on the ground or not. However, there is no detection to whether the vehicle is skidding or not. So we have to pull this information from the tire state. Okay. So what we are going to do is take a copy of this cause wheel, the vehicle movement component, which has already been casted for us here on begin play. So we select it and Ctrl D to duplicate it. We're breaking up here, get wheel state. And basically this allows us to get access to the information belonging to each wheel. Okay. However, if you notice here, we need the wheel index, but we have 4 wheels. So we actually need to loop through all of them. And let's add a for loop. And since we have 4 wheels and their index goes from 0 to 3, we're going to loop from 0 to 3. And then we're going to use the index to retrieve the wheel state of each wheel. Okay. Once you have the wheel state, we break it. And it's interesting because this function is called get wheel state, but then the structure is called wheel status. Anyway, within the wheel status, we have the is skidding, and this is the information that we need. It's a Boolean, so it can be either true or false. And of course, once when the Boolean is true, the wheel is skidding. So we want to use that information to understand whether we did or not to activate the skid sound for the whole car. So what we want to do at this point is create a Boolean variable, b car is skidding. And before going into the loop, we want to set this one to false, because we don't know yet whether it's skidding. So let's compile so we have access. So this is initially false. Then we loop through all the wheels. We get the state. And based on the state, we take the variable that we just created and we set it by dragging it onto the loop body. And now what we want to do, let me start this up because I don't like them to be overlapping. And now what we can do, take the skidding sound, or it with the current value of this Boolean, and then reassign it to itself. So what happens is that if any of the wheels, at least one wheel, is skidding, car is skidding will become true. You can modify this code and just count how many wheels are skidding and maybe base your triggering logic on that one. But to keep it simple, we will say, okay, if at least one wheel is skidding, then the whole car is skidding and we will activate the skid sound. Now, when the loop is finished, now we have the information to whether the car is skidding or not. And let's give us a bit more room. I'm moving down this part of the code, which is pre-existing. Make sure we have enough room for our own code here. So out of the loop, when the loop is completed, we can use that information to set the volume multiplier of the skid sound. And what we will do is set it to 1 if the value is true, or set it to 0 if it's false. Now we could take this variable, which is a boolean, and connect it directly to the volume, and Unreal will convert the boolean to a float, so that when the boolean is true, float is 1, and when the boolean is false, float is 0. It's not a perfect way to do it, but it works, and in a moment we will make it nicer, but for the time being, let's see whether this is working. Now, if you're wondering what determines if the tire is skidding or not, the information is actually inside the wheel blueprint. So to retrieve the wheel blueprint, we can click on the vehicle movement component, and then under wheel setup, if we open this array, we see that there are actually 2 wheel blueprints being used, one for the front wheels and one for the rear wheels. If we open one of them, and we can browse to it in the content browser, it's actually was in the same folder as car, and open it, we find a value called skid threshold. So whenever the skid speed exceeds this threshold, then the wheel is skidding and the boolean becomes true, otherwise it's false. And we also have a slip, which is the same but for the longitudinal velocity of the wheel. At the moment we'll work with the skid. Okay, so if you want your car to skid earlier, lower this threshold. If you want it to skid later, so at a higher speed, you want to increase this threshold. We will leave it at the default value for the moment. Let's close and let's go back and test. And let's drive around. And as we start to skid, you start hearing the skid sound. And of course the loop is not perfect. You can use a better one, but at least it gives the idea of skidding. Now, what you might notice is that the skidding is and non-skidding is very abrupt. So the transition from having the skid sound to not having the skid sound is very abrupt. So we want to make it smoother. And the way to make it smoother is to add a bit of interpolation to the volume. So let's go back to our blueprint, and we're going to create a new float variable called skid volume, and make sure the type is float. And now what we will do is I'm using alt click to disconnect this node, and this one we can delete, by the way. We will use the function called select and connect the boolean to it. And as I do that, you see that it changes to true and false. What we want to do is to use its value into a finterp node. So I'm going to right click and find the finterp2 node, and then connect the return value of the select to target. So this is the target target value that we want to have. And of course, when the boolean is true, the volume has to be 1. When it's false, the volume has to be 0. Now the current value of the skid volume is in the variable we just created. So I'm going to drag and connect it. Delta time, you can grab it from the event tick here. It has delta seconds, but it's a bit too far. But you can always retrieve it with the function called getWord delta seconds, to spell it correctly. And when it comes to interpolation speed, this is how quickly we are going from one value to the other, so from 0 to 1 and from 1 to 0. You can experiment a bit with it. I like to have an 8. Okay. Finally, we connect this to the set volume multiplier, because this is our volume. And last but not least, we have to update the value of the skid volume variable. So when we come back, next tick to this, it can work with the current value, updated current value. So I'm gonna drag it here and then assign this. Double click on the line to make a route pin and drag it down to make it pretty. Okay. Let's see how this new transition is working. So let's play. Yeah, better. And maybe we can also use a bit of faster interpolation, but now you hear that the sound fades in and then fades out as we stop skidding. Yeah, there's another thing that you can do to make this a bit more interesting if you wish, which is to change the pitch of the sound. So when you start skidding, the pitch is a bit lower, but then as the speed increases and you skid more and more and more, the the pitch can be higher. Now to do that, we basically need to know the speed of the vehicle. So we can drag another reference. So let's duplicate the reference to the vehicle movement component. Let's drag out of it and type get forward speed. And this speed is in real units per second, so centimeters per second, but actually I like to work with the kilometers per hour. So I'm gonna multiply this value for a conversion factor, which is 0.036. And now with this one, we introduce a node called map range clamped and connect the output of the multiplication to it. And now we need to set few values. So the in range is the speed in kilometers per hour. So we said 0 is when the car is standing still, and the maximum speed, let's say that is 250. So at 250 we'll get the maximum pitch. And as output range, that's the pitch variation. So when the car is near still, because remember that when it's absolutely still, we have no skidding anyway, so you will not hear the sound. But let's say that we want the pitch to be multiplied by 0.9. And when it's maximum speed, we go to 1.2. And with that, we can, I think, use the same reference to the audio component and call set pitch multiplier. Drag it up, connect it to the set, and actually double click to add a route node, make it clean. Let's drag it a bit to the right here, including the route pin. And this one, maybe we can make it a bit more compact like this. And the map range clamped goes into the output, actually, of the map range clamped goes into the set pitch multiplier node. Okay, so what this does basically, again, as the car skids at higher and higher speed, we are increasing the pitch of the skid sound, which is basically what you would expect from such a physical situation. Okay, so compile and save, close, and let's test it. Let's drive and then skid. And now let's drive even faster. So I don't know if it's noticeable, but as the speed decreases, the pitch of the speed sound goes down. It's pretty realistic. It's still not perfect, but I think good enough for a tutorial and a demonstration. Okay, now that our skid sound is set, let's move on to the skid marks. So back to the content drawer, we're gonna right click on the content folder and create a new folder called textures. And I'm gonna import to this folder the tire skid mark PNG. Once it's imported, let's double click to look at it, and you see that there are some transparencies ongoing. And actually, if I turn off the different channels, you will see that basically this is just the transparency mask, which is good enough. You can also use a texture with all channels plus transparency channel. But in this case, this is what I found, and this is what we are going to use. Let's click to close, and then in the content browser, we right click on the texture and we create a material out of it. And we call it tire skid mark. And this is the material that we can use to create our skid mark. Now what we want to do is to set the material so that it's in the domain of defer decal, because we are using a decal method, and then blend mode translucent. And basically that allows us to connect the A channel to opacity. And now you start to see our skid mark. Of course, it's on a sphere. We can also show it on a plane. And here it is. Now later on we're going to modify this and add also the possibility to control a bit the opacity. I'll show it, but let's start with the simplest setup. So I'm going to save the material, let the shader compile. And now let's go back to our level. And to test our material, what we can do very easily and very quickly is basically to add, let's go for example in this area, I'm clicking in the level and pressing F to go in the area. And I'm gonna add all classes a decal actor, because we want to test our decal. Okay. Once the actor is in the level, let's position it so that it intersects the floor, because this is the ground, that's where we want our decal to appear. And now as decal material, I'm selecting our tire skid mark material. Okay. Now what you see is, just don't mind the scale that I mentioned, because we're gonna set it up later. But you see that it doesn't look that good, right? So let's select the rotation tool and now see what do we need to do to make it look good. So do I have, for example, to rotate it by 90 degrees? Yeah, that looks like it. So if you notice, I rotated it around the y-axis, so the green axis, by 90 degrees, and now it looks good. Okay. And we want to remember that, make sure that we take that into account, and I can also set these angles to 0, by the way. Will still look proper. What we want to do is make sure that we remember that in order to have a good decal, properly looking decal on the ground, this needs to be set at 90. Okay. So we don't need this actor anymore. Actually, let's leave it there just for reference. We can come back, but we'll delete it later. And what we want to do is, in the content drawer, go back to our sports car blueprint. Okay. Okay, so let's look at the upper portion of the code we wrote earlier for the skid sound. and we can build on it. So here we are setting the value of the skidding variable. Fine. Now, if we want to spawn a decall, so let's call the node, which is called spawn decall at location, because we want it to stay on the ground. You will notice that we need a few pieces of information. So first of all, we need the decall material, and this we have created earlier. So that's our M tire skid mark. So that we have. Then we need the decall size, and let's guess, but maybe 10 by 10 by 10. And we will change this later because we will notice that we will need to scale the decall based on the speed. And this is one characteristic of working with decall. So you have to scale them based on the speed so that they nicely join one to the other. Okay. But more about this in a moment. Then the other thing that we need is the location where we want to spawn the decall. Now, if we look at the wheel status, we have actually the contact point. So this is the contact point between the tire and the ground. And actually, we can use this as a location for the decall. But a very important thing, if we want to spawn the decall, we have to make sure that the tire is in contact with the ground. So the first thing that we need to do is actually use this in contact information with a branch and make sure that if there is no contact of the tire with the ground, we're not spawning the decall. So I added a branch, and now I'm connecting the in contact boolean, and let's just double click to reroute it a bit better. So now we're spawning a decall only if the tire is in contact with the ground. And we are taking also a reference to contact point and dragging into the location, because that's the location where we want to spawn the decall. Now, the other thing to notice is what is the rotation of the decall. So you remember one thing, that we need to rotate the decall actor by 90 degrees if we want it to look nice. And the last parameters is the lifespan. So how long in seconds will the decall stay on the ground? And we don't want them to stay forever, but to try, we can use a longer time span and then lifespan, and then later on maybe reduce it to 10-15 seconds, so we don't have too many spawned. But for the moment, let's say that we want it 60 seconds, 1 minute, so the decalls will stay on the ground for 1 minute. Okay, with this done, and I've left a bit more room because we will need to add some code here. Let's see what it looks like, and we will notice a couple of issues which we need to solve. Let me remove, once we're back into the level, this decall actor, because I don't like to have it there, so delete. And now let's play. And you see that we already have the decalls being spawned. And there are a few things. So first of all, yes, we are taking into account that the tire is in contact with the ground, but we didn't take into account whether the tire is skidding or not. So we actually have to use also the is skidding value. So back to our blueprint, let's fix that. So what we want to feed in the branch is skidding, is in contact, and is skidding. Okay. So we can actually, let's connect this to here. Let's connect this to the first. It does it, yes. And is skinned into the second. And it's commutative anyway, so it doesn't matter, but I think it's nicer. And now we can connect it down here. And it's a route pin. I think we drag it this way so it looks nice and tidy. Okay, now we should see the decalls spawning only when the tire is skidding. And in fact, they don't appear at the beginning. And now if we start skidding, we're seeing the decals. Now, one thing that you will notice is that the decals are always spawned with the same rotation, so they don't seem to follow the direction of traveling of the tires. And this is something that we definitely need to fix. And the other thing that you will see is that the faster I go and the more spaced they become. So what we also need to do is scale them in the direction of motion depending on the speed of the car so that they join nicely. How we do that is, let's go back to our car blueprint, and first things first, let's fix the direction of the decals. Okay, so if the car is traveling in a certain direction, we need to know that direction so that we can orient the decals to it. And what I'm gonna do is take a reference to the vehicle mesh. Let's drag it here, and then use a function. Let me zoom in. Get physics linear velocity at point, and we need to plug this in after the branch, because remember we want to do this only if we are skidding and we are in contact with the ground. The point at which you want to retrieve the velocity is the contact point of the tire. So I'm gonna double click here and drag a reference into it. And now what we want to do with this value, let me give a bit more room here, is to take the velocity vector in this case and use it to make a rotator. So I'm going to use make rotator from X. And I know these functions are a bit mysterious, but basically since the velocity is a forward vector in this case, we're going to make a rotator using a forward vector. So we're going to use make rotator from X. And now, if I would plug this directly into this rotation, we will lose the 90 or the minus 90. Okay, and we don't want that. So what we're going to do is add the combined rotators actually, and plug the rotator we just created as a B, and as a A we leave 0, minus 90 or 90 actually. That's our Y angle that we need, and 0 for the yaw. Okay, so basically we're saying add this local rotation to whatever this rotator is, and then we plug this into rotation. Now if we did everything correctly, we should see that the skid marks are now following the orientation of the tires, with one exception that we're gonna show in a moment, because remember we have the front tires, front wheels are steering. We are not taking into account the steering angle, but actually we can do that in a second. Let's first test it. You might notice that it's already good enough in this way. You see that now the decals are following the direction of the car and the direction which the wheels are traveling. But of course we can be a bit more sophisticated for the front wheels that are steering. So let's go back to our blueprint, and if we look at the wheel status, we have the slip angle. So this is basically the difference between the orientation of the front wheels and the direction in which the front wheels are traveling. And we can use this to make the rotation of our decals a bit more accurate, a bit more interesting. So in order to get that value down here, we can make a bit more room. Then we right click on the combined rotators and we split the start pin. And that value will go into the yaw. So now we have to do a bit of routing, but drag the sleep angle here. And if you drag and then press, type RER, you can get a route node right away without having to double click. And now we can drag it down here and connect it to the yaw and then make it look prettier. I think it's good enough. Let's compile and save. And now play. And of course you will not notice a big difference, but maybe in certain maneuvers, when you are drifting, or that will make it more accurate in that sense. So that's a bit of plus. Okay, the last thing that we need to fix, and notice that we don't get skid marks when the tires are not in contact. Oops. Let's actually go and do a jump. Okay, we should be doing a jump while skidding, which is a bit complicated. But okay, that was it. Okay, so what we want to do is go back now to our blueprint. The part that we need to address is the decal sides right here. So at the moment is set to be fixed at 10, 10, 10, but we understood that we need to stretch the decals along the direction of motion according to the velocity so that they join seamlessly. So good news is that we already have the velocity because we have the get physics linear velocity at point for the current wheel. So what we can do is use that information, and let's drag out of the return value, and then let's take the length of this vector, and this will give us the velocity as a scalar, which we call conventionally speed. And since this speed is in centimeters per second, I'm going to convert it to kilometers per hour. And I think by now that we need to multiply by 0.036. So that's the conversion factor. And what we need to do now is take this value and feed it into a map range clamp node, where we can use a bit of the same logic we already did for the sound. So the in range starts at 0 and goes to 250, assuming this is the maximum speed of the car in kilometers per hour. And the out range is the scaling of the decal. Okay. Now, since we rotated the decal around the y-axis, so normally the x-axis points forward and the y-axis is right, and the z-axis is up. Now, since we rotated by 90 degrees around the right axis, the y-axis, now z points forward. So we know that we have to scale the decal along the z-axis, but we also want to retain the other two values. So what we want to do is we move this a bit to the right, give ourselves a bit of room. We have some crisscrossing of the lines. So let's see how we can solve that. Okay, good. And we want to make this vector. So I'm gonna add a node called make vector. And basically the value out of the map range claimed, and note that we have to assign the out range still. I'm gonna feed it into the Z, and the 10 and the 10 will be the X and the Y. Those we retain because it's kind of fixed. Actually, the Y depends also on the width of your tire. So if you have very wide tires or very thin ones, you might want to adjust that as well. I found that in this case 10 and 10 works fine. And then we plug it into the decal sides input. Okay. Now, what should we use as ranges? This is a bit trials and errors, but we had 10 before and we know it's not enough. So what we want to do is maybe use a 30. and see how it behaves. The first one, the range A, we can leave to 0. That is fine. Anyway, it's not skidding at 0 speed, so that won't affect anyway our sides. And maybe with this we can try it out and see how it behaves. And I already foresee a problem, which by the way we also had with the sound, but we didn't know this, so we're going to fix it in a moment. So compile and save once more, and let's play that. And let's see how it goes with the speed. Okay, still not enough, so we need to increase the volume. Now it's a 30, let's double it. Let's do the 60. Compile and save. Let's see if it's better. Slightly better, but still a little gap, which we notice. Yeah, so we definitely need to increase that one. Let's go to 80. Compile and save. Yes, a slight overlap now, but it's not very visible. I wonder if there are still gaps. I don't see any. And you're already starting to see the problem that I was mentioning. So let's go at very high speed and see. Yeah, looks good also at very high speed. So that's the top speed that this car can make in this track, given the walls and the length side to side. But you can always tweak it further. Now the problem that I was mentioning is, see what happens if we reverse and now we turn. Do the skid marks look good? Yeah, they do, but maybe they need a bit more tweaking. And actually, what we may want to do is, now in the case of the vector length, this is always positive, regardless of the direction of the vector. There is nothing such a negative vector length. But for our sound, since we are using the forward speed of the car, we might want to add an abs node here, just to make sure that we are not working with negative values. Okay, that's valid for the pitch in this case. Okay, so we seem to have also a good handling and a good behavior of the skid marks with the change in the speed. Next thing that we might want to do is maybe adjust the lifespan. I'm not sure that you want to have the skid marks on for 60 seconds. It depends on your gameplay, whether you're gonna go back to where you produced the skid marks. That might help actually. But otherwise you might want to reduce it. On the other hand, let's check the efficiency of our skid marks by playing the game and then switching to the shader complexity mode. So you do that by pressing F5 on the keyboard, and then let's see whether we see any red or any white, and we don't, which basically means our skid marks are pretty good when it comes to efficiency. So if we switch back to our full mode, then you can see them. So I think that we did a pretty good job. Maybe another fine tuning that can be done is to play a bit with the thresholds. The moment the car is skidding also at very low speed, maybe that's not very realistic. I want to increase a bit the thresholds. Let's try that. So if you remember, the thresholds are inside the wheel front and wheel rear blueprints. Right now the skid threshold is 20, maybe let's use a 30. Compile and save. And let's do the same for the other one. Oh, actually the skid threshold of this one is much higher. So these are the rear wheels. Okay, interesting. So it means that the front wheels are skidding much earlier. Okay, not sure that's a good idea. But let's see what happens if we apply the same threshold also to the front wheels. Curious to see whether we are still getting any skidding. Yeah, we are. But maybe it's a bit better. Yes, we don't get the skidding at very low speed like before. Still think it's a very high value, so you might want to tweak it a bit. And in general, for testing, it's good to have low values, so the skidding happens more often and you can see it and tweak it. But in this case, yeah, it's not too bad, I think. 100 and 100 might do the trick. Okay. So I think this is it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching. As usual, I will make the full project available if you don't want to type. You'll find it in the description, and I will also add some more improvements, like for example making the skin marks more or less opaque or evident depending on the suspension force, and maybe some other tweaks that I can think of, maybe adding a bit more to the sound cue in terms of variations. But yeah, let's see. Again, thanks for watching and see you in the next one. Bye.